There's a new book on the market entitled Prophecy Watch by Thomas Ice and Timothy Demi. And Thomas Ice is with us on today's program. He is the Executive Director of the Pre-Trib Research Center in Washington, D.C. And we're happy to have you on today's program. And Gary Stearman is here, and we're going to be talking about the book Prophecy Watch. Gary?
You know, J.R., Thomas Ice, I've followed his work for years, and I would say he's on the cutting edge of studies in biblical prophecy. And we've got so many questions that we're going to have to start asking him right away, otherwise we won't have enough time.
Well, first we say thanks for coming.
It's good to be here, J.R. After watching you for all these years, it's great to be on your program.
In your book, you're talking about biblical prophecy and signs of the end times and the year 2000 and date setting. And on page 22, you said, if Christ has not returned by the year 2000, then it appears that the septa-millennial theory will have exhausted all possible avenues of adjustment and fulfillment. First, what is the septa-millennial theory?
Well, like a lot of theological terms, that's a Latin term. You know, in Europe, they spoke different languages. They got together, they spoke Latin, so a lot of our terms come from there. And that has to do with the word seven. It's a 7,000-year theory that believes, based on creation's 6 days, that there's going to be 6,000 years for human history and then the 1,000-year millennia for God to rest. And so it's the belief that the total length of time that God has decreed for human history before the second coming will be 6,000 years. And this has been a widely held view. I mean, almost virtually everybody held it for the first 1,000 years or so of the church, at least when they talked about it. And
so here we are coming up to the seventh, the septa.
Well, that's right. And it's so ingrained in Western European history. This is why the secular people all talk about it. And originally, people took the chronology from the Septuagint, which is 1,500 years roughly inflated. So they basically believed in the year 500 was the 6,000th year. And they realized, of course, that it wasn't. Then they, when they rediscovered Hebrew in the Reformation, for example, Bishop Ussher, the reason he put dates in the Bible is he was trying to figure out the date. He was a date setter.
For the second coming. Well,
That's
aren't
right.
we all a little bit?
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, unless you believed it happened in AD 70 or something. But the fact of the matter is, and of course that's date setting too, but the fact of the matter is that the Hebrew Masoretic text, creation was around the year 4000, I think exactly on the year 4000.
Yeah, BC.
And therefore the year 2000 is 6,000 years. And you know, there's no other variants of this interpretation out there. And so it will either have been vindicated or it will have been proven to not be true.
And how long do we have to wait past the year 2000 before we all go fishing?
Well, I don't know, but I've always thought if there was a good date-setting scheme that I'm attracted to, it's that one. Because technically it's not a date setting for the second coming, it's simply saying that this is how long history is going to be. But
right.
I loosely, you know, am inclined to it and believe it's wrong to date set second coming.
Let me just throw a question out here, because we do have critics in the media. The secular media love to poke fun at evangelicals who are talking about Christ's coming. And yet this is the blessed hope for us. So what do we say to our critics about the millennium and millennial fever?
Well, millennial fever is not any hotter. In fact, I think it's in decline if you know history. And 150 years ago, there were a lot more date setters running around and a lot more millennial fever. Those that are, in fact, I don't see within our belief system, people that believe like you and I on Bible prophecy, I don't think hardly anybody's taking the year 2000 seriously, because it's not, you don't see people writing, people are using the word 2000 in a lot of their titles for books.
Yes.
Because the public's interested in that. But I don't know of anybody in our camp that believes that Christ is going to come back by the year 2000 because of the septamillennial view. 150 years ago, people like William Miller and whole denominations sprang out of this kind of stuff. This is the belief system, for example, that David Koresh held. It's called historicism. That the church age is contemporaneous with the events of the book of Revelation, and days mean years, and so if 1,260 days is really 1,260 years, and so to be a historicist in essence, you couldn't be one without being a date setter. And everybody from Martin Luther on down, Luther set 1562 is the time for the second coming, and Bishop Ussher, of course, and all of these people have set dates. And basically, because we believe that the rapture and the second coming are two events, we believe the rapture could happen at any moment. And the arrival of Darby and others who taught the Pre-Trib rapture very strongly put an end to a lot of date setting. But it doesn't mean that we believe that there are no signs of the times.
And as the signs of the times develop, then we can see more clearly what lies ahead. Not that we can see the date, but
that's right.
We at least can see the events and feel that it is near. Now, the idea of pre-millennial view means Christ will return before pre-millennium. That millennium is the seventh millennium, is it not?
Well, no, the Bible doesn't have in mind any specific, well, within the septimillennial view, that's correct. But the premillennial view is taught in Revelation 20, it just says Christ will come before a 1,000-year period. It doesn't say specifically how long it will be before he returns.
But it's one of the millenniums of history that will be the kingdom age.
That's correct.
But it was a given back in the days of John that it was the seventh millennium.
Yeah, in fact, you know, we have all kinds of historical documentation that the belief in the 6,000-year theory existed long before the book of Revelation was written by the Jews. In fact, many of the Jews speculated that the kingdom, which is talked about in the Old Testament, and the New Testament tells us it's 1,000 years, and in the book of Revelation 6 times, that many speculated before John wrote that and received that revelation from God that the kingdom would be 1,000 years. They had other numbers, but 1,000 was a very popular view.
J.R., in chapter 5 of Dr. Ice's book, may I call you just Thomas? Or?
Sure, Tommy.
Tommy, okay, and you can call me Gary.
Okay.
Chapter 5 has this question: what are the signs of the end of the church age? That's an excellent question. How do you answer that?
Well, the signs of the end of the church age is apostasy.
Okay.
Do you know that the second most frequently mentioned subject statistically in all the New Testament is apostasy?
Laodicea.
And you never hear anybody talk about it today. We hear all this talk about revival. There's going to be revival. Well, there may be, but the Bible doesn't even talk, New Testament doesn't even talk about revival for the church. It talks about a revival for Israel in the tribulation. And I'm not saying we won't have revival. I pray we do. But that's something God sovereignly gives or doesn't give, and there's no scriptural basis to say we're going to have a revival. And yet a lot of people are saying that nowadays. And I'm simply saying there's no scriptural basis for that. But they're not talking about what the Bible talks about all the time, apostasy, which means doctrinal defection. That as the church grows, it doesn't mean that there's not going to be a lot of people saved. There are. As the church grows, then the quality of the doctrine will decline. And that's what we're seeing in our own day.
You know, in the last century, since the last century, with the last half of the 1800s into the first half of the 1900s, all kinds of denominations sprang up in early America, for example, and I suppose in Europe as well. The Cumberland Revival, and out of that came several different denominations. And a lot of these denominations grew up on one pet doctrine, which divided them from everybody else. And perhaps this is the seeds of Laodicea.
Well, yeah, and Laodicea, which I tend to believe, the seven movements of church history, and we're in Laodicea, you know, those are people who were neither hot nor cold. You know, and you know, everybody's got a little religion in America especially, but they're not when it comes to their lifestyles, secularism has been so blended in. Now, they may go and get emotional at church and cry or do something, but when they go and live their life 6 days a week, it doesn't really impact them. You know, so all these statistics show.
Yeah, I noticed this, the statistics you gave here from a poll that was taken and published in December of 1994. It says Americans who believe Jesus will return to earth, 61%. Of those who believe that he will come within the next few years or decades, 34%, longer than that, 37%. Those who believe the world will come to an end, 59%, within a few years, only 12%. In other words, they talk a good game, but they don't really believe.
The Lord delayeth his coming. The evil servant says the Lord delayeth his coming. Don't come in my lifetime, you know.
Yeah.
Wow, that's fascinating. And you know, we find a lot of confusion today. We've only got 30 seconds left before we have to take a break, but in that brief time, there seems to be a change in the way people are thinking today.
Right, there really is, and I think it's due to the shift away from a more rational culture that had preceded World War II in the United States for about 250 years to a more mystical culture. So people are more open to hot flash ideas, so to speak, and impulses rather than studying the Bible inductively and coming up with conclusions.
You know, Gary, this idea of the Lord is coming soon is popular, but I understand that you see a waning of enthusiasm across America.
Yes, you know, it's starting, you know, in the schools and things like this for the last 10, 15 years. There's been schools that have traditionally believed like you and I and taught that fervently are tending to come up with new spins and interpretations that in effect has led to a decline of interest, more neglect in Bible prophecy. And so many of the professors now in these schools that we formerly looked to and many of the students just aren't interested in these. They're just interested in other things. And so as a result, people aren't teaching the Bible, in other words, and that's combined with an overall decline in interest in the Bible to begin with and theology. And everybody said, you know, does all these polls now, and biblical literacy is tremendously on the decline, even though there's more and more stuff available for Christians to grow in. And so that's contributed to a decline in interest in Bible prophecy because people aren't interested in the Bible as a whole, and so they're not interested in that. And part of it is this preoccupation with the self. They're not interested in the past or the future. And of course the Bible teaches you need to know what Christ did for you in the past, and you need to know where you're going in the future, and that impacts your life in the present.
That's a great thought. You know, in the present, as teachers of Bible prophecy, J.R. and I constantly run into people who believe they have a very forceful sign that the end is very, very near. Israel is usually reckoned as a sign that the end is very, very near, and I know you've done a lot of thinking about modern Israel. We hear, for example, this is the 50th year of Israel's statehood, 50 being the year of Jubilee. We naturally hear a lot of association people saying, wow, this could be the year because Israel's been a state for 50 years. What do you think about Israel and the way we should relate to Israel as students of Bible prophecy?
Well, I believe that Israel is God's super sign of the end times, and the fact that He has regathered her, as Ezekiel chapter 20, Ezekiel 22, Zephaniah 2, 1 through 2 teach, before the tribulation, it says, to me means that just generally, you know, I don't know when, but in the near future, He's going to do something prophetically. And while the rapture is signless, there are no signs relating to the rapture. That's why you can't date it. There is God's preparation for the tribulation. And one of the things that needs to be, in order for Israel to start the tribulation, to make that covenant, they have to be in existence before the tribulation begins. And so just as God prepared for Christ coming, you know, the Bible talks about the mystery of iniquity that doth already work. The stage is being set in that realm, and the restrainer is holding back Satan, although we see Satan's plan developing within the permission of God. The same is happening. And my friend Henry Morris, when he comes to dealing with the book of Genesis, says, let's go back and take the biblical data or information from the Bible that tells us about creation and build a model, a framework for how the past, God created the world in the past. We can do the same thing for prophecy. We can look to the future, and you know there's more biblical data about the tribulation than any other period in all biblical history, and therefore you can build a model of what the tribulation is going to be like, what nations are going to be involved, what people are going to be involved, and you can say Israel's going to be back in the land, they're going to have control of Jerusalem. By the middle of the tribulation, they're going to have a temple rebuilt, you're going to have the revival of the Roman Empire, Russia's a player, Israel's ancient enemies are being done. We see globalism, the apostate church, cashless society. You see this model is developed, and we see all of these things coming to place, especially in the last 50 years. And so that is a sign, not a date setting or anything like that, but a sign that I believe we're very near. And so I can believe, since the rapture is a separate event from the tribulation, I can both believe that the rapture could happen at any moment and there are no signs indicating, but at the same time, my anticipation is heightened by saying there's a general belief that the Lord is going to come back because we see all these signs going on.
Now, you were a pastor some years ago in your development as a minister and as a Christian and student of the Word of God. You were a Reconstructionist and did not believe in prophetic studies of sorts?
Well, I was
how is your development now to become the executive director of the Pre-Trib, that's Pre-Tribulation Rapture, Research Group?
Well, it was my debates 10, 12 years ago. I was a Reconstructionist for about 10 or 12 years, and I always was a premillennialist though, but I almost became a postmillennialist, but I didn't. But I flirted with it, okay, and then I realized that I shouldn't even have anything to do with this in all the different areas of what Reconstructionism, and I don't want to get into that. And it was out of that, thing 10, 12 years ago that sparked my interest in Bible prophecy. I would say I only had an average interest as a pastor, and I became very interested in interacting with their false views of prophecy. And so that's what springboarded me, so to speak, into specializing, I guess you would say, in these last days in Bible prophecy.
Tell us about the founding of the Pre-Trib Research Center.
Well, I met Tim LaHaye, about 6 or 7 years ago, and we got to talking about the changes that were taking place on the prophetic landscape. And we both agreed that there have been major changes going on. And we also realized that our views, belief in the rapture and the literal interpretation of prophecy and premillennialism and stuff, were not being defended from the traditional sources anymore. And so we said, hey, let's call a conference like they had in Ireland, the Albury Conference of scholars, prophetic teachers, people like yourself, and bring them together once a year for us to talk with each other, kind of a prophecy conference for prophecy teachers and ministries and authors. And we did this 6 or 7 years ago, and we then said we ought to have an organization, and so he invited me to move up in the Washington, D.C. area where he was living at the time, and I became director of the Pre-Trib Research Center, so that's kind of how it started. And we've especially done a lot of study in the area of the history of the rapture and the history of Bible prophecy and stuff like that, and we hope to do a lot more in the future.
I'd like for you to speak about the word imminency. I guess we could say the any moment coming of Christ for the church. From the point of view of the pre-tribulation rapture, the doctrine of imminency.
Yeah, that's another one of those Latin terms, like rapture is a Latin term.
That's true.
Some people say sometimes the rapture is not in the Bible. Well, it is if you have a Latin Bible, but the fact of the matter is imminency means, from our perspective, that Christ could come at any moment. And what this means is that there is no signs that have to be fulfilled before Christ could return. And therefore, those passages that talk about in the Bible, a dozen or so about watching and waiting, this is only possible if a pre-trib rapture is true.
And we should be, I guess we're encouraged to be very watchful. And in fact, that's what we do here, is we encourage people to watch and to be aware of the signs.
One reason why I like the title of your book, Prophecy Watch.
There's a certain activeness about that title.
Right. We conclude each program with keep looking up,
That's right.
And because we need to be watching for the second coming of Jesus Christ.